In the quiet town of Ängelholm, Sweden, nestled among the quaint streets and cozy homes, a curious mind was at work. Richard Handel, a man who had dreams of being extraordinary, or maybe a death wish, started his own little experiment in his kitchen. Little did his neighbors know, behind the doors of his unassuming apartment, Richard was about to start on a journey into the realms of nuclear physics that would challenge laws, test boundaries, and leave a mark on history, or at least on his Bunsen burner. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Y'all, I promise I'm not obsessed with Sweden, but alas, here we are yet again in the land of the midnight sun. Sweden has actually been using nuclear power for electricity generation since the 1970s. At its peak, nuclear power accounted for about half of Sweden's electricity production. And Swedish scientists have made significant contributions to nuclear physics. For example, the physicist Hannes Alfvén was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1970 for his work in magnetohydrodynamics and its applications in the study of plasmas, whatever any of that means. One thing that Richard Handel had in common with Hannes Alfvén was that they were both Swedish. One thing that they don't have in common is that Hannes was a physicist and Richard is not. Richard Handel was born May 23, 1980. His father was a pharmacist and always assumed that Richard would become one too. Richard would say that, quote, visiting my father in his pharmacy was very exciting, end quote. Richard says he has Asperger's and he was a bit of a nerd. He loved doing chemical experiments, and when he was 13, he made some explosives in the garden of his childhood home, using stuff from the paint store, gunpowder, and some items from his dad's pharmacy. In his late teens, Richard was diagnosed with some mental health conditions that made his dream of becoming a pharmacist a bit out of reach. He moved into an apartment of his own and started working in a factory, but in 2011, he lost his job. At 31, and with a lot more free time on his hands, Richard decided, like every regular human being, to dedicate some time to creating a real-life periodic table of the elements. He was collecting elements, physically. Well, not all of the elements, because as he said, quote, there are some very unstable radioactive elements like polonium and francium that last just a couple of minutes and then decay. They're impossible to get, end quote. But if they weren't decaying, he was collecting them, including the radioactive ones like radium and uranium and americium. He purchased all of these elements legally, though sometimes from abroad. I actually learned through the course of research for this episode that you can buy older consumer products that often contain radioactive materials. So that's what Richard did. He actually scavenged from lots of old products to get his elements. He got radium from old clock hands and americium from smoke detectors. He obtained thorium from a Coleman gas lantern mantle and bought depleted uranium from a U.S. supplier. His real-life periodic table was coming together nicely, it seems. Then, Richard read a story in Harper's Magazine that told a story of a Michigan boy named David Hahn who grew up in the 1990s and managed to turn his potting shed into a nuclear reactor. 16 years later, Richard was inspired to do the same. He had already managed to gather the ingredients after all. In addition to the elements, he bought a radiator suitable for transmutation and instruments to measure the reaction, including a Geiger counter. He spent about 5,000 to 6,000 kroner, or about $1,000 in 2024 America, in materials and equipment. He also started a blog called Richard's Reactor, in which he documented the progress of the reactor. His first blog entry said, quote, my project is to build a working nuclear reactor, not to gain electricity, just for fun, and to see if it's possible to split atoms at home, end quote. Seems innocent enough, right? No, not right, no. The experiments all started in a saucepan. The americium and radium were placed into it. He combined them with beryllium and sulfuric acid and set them on the burner. Wild bubbles erupted from the concoction, causing it to splatter across the stovetop and onto the floor. He captioned a photo of the destruction, "The Meltdown," and he posted it to his blog after quickly turning off the stove. So to toast Richard, the kitchen scientist, we're going to make a special cocktail today, the Atomic. The Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce and local casinos were responsible for popularizing the Atomic, which is a champagne-based cocktail. This cocktail was first introduced in the 1950s. Atomic City was a nickname that was occasionally used to refer to Las Vegas during this time period, so it makes sense that the drink was coined there. During the same time period, several drinks with a similar concept were invented, and the word has been used in a general sense to refer to these cocktails. These cocktails typically make reference to atoms, nuclear fission, or rocket missions. To make our Atomic in a cocktail format, we're going to take 1 part vodka, 1 part brandy, and 1/4 part sherry and add to a shaker with ice. We will shake until chilled and combined, strain over fresh ice, and top with a dry champagne, garnishing the glass with an orange wheel. For the mocktail version, add 1 part non-alcoholic vodka, 1 part white grape juice, and 1/4 part, or a little bit less, apple cider vinegar to a shaker with ice, and shake it up like you're making a mixture to split the atom. Then strain over fresh ice, top with seltzer, and garnish with a similarly adorable orange wheel. Drink up, knowing that the Swedish Radiation Authority has no authority over your drinking habits. Richard claimed that his original intent was to conduct the experiment again, but this time to collect the neutrons released by the mixture into a test tube. Then he planned to fire this neutron ray at a chunk of uranium sealed in a glass marble. There's a lot of sciencey stuff here, but I do know that he would have had to use the Geiger counter to measure the neutrons to make sure he'd done it right because they are invisible. I really have no idea. Richard is definitely smarter than me. Well, in some ways anyway. Richard was never really able to do any of his Geiger counting, however. He decided to email the Swedish Radiation Authority in July 2011, after the meltdown, to make sure he was doing everything by the book and above board. The email read, quote, "Hello, I'm very interested in nuclear physics and radiation. I have planned a project to build a primitive nuclear reactor. Now I'm wondering if I'm violating any laws doing so?" End quote. They wrote back around 3 weeks later saying, quote, "Hi. The short answer to your question is that if you build a nuclear reactor without permission, you are violating strict laws. It is a criminal offense and can lead to fines or imprisonment for up to 2 years." End quote. Richard was actually pretty surprised. He had a very small amount of the radioactive material and so couldn't create a bomb or really do anything beyond giving himself some radiation exposure. He didn't seem overly worried about that or thought splitting the atom in his kitchen was worth the risk. However, within days of the email response, on July 22nd, 2011, the Swedish Radiation Authority showed up to his house with the police. He said on his blog, quote, "I was ordered by the police to get out of the building with my hands up. Then 3 men came with Geiger counters and searched me." End quote. They arrested him for a crime against the radiation safety law. Richard maintained that he was conducting a legitimate experiment out of scientific curiosity and had no idea of the legal ramifications of his actions. And I'd say, based on that email, yeah, that's right. I mean, the man made a literal public blog to talk about what he was doing. He definitely didn't think he was doing anything wrong or breaking any laws. However, his lack of expertise and disregard for safety protocols raised serious concerns among authorities. Richard made headlines around the world. His story garnered international attention, sparking debates about the risks of amateur nuclear experiments and the need for stricter regulations. Richard was convicted in July 2014 on the violation of the Radiation Safety Act and the violation of Swedish Environmental Code. He was fined 13,600 kroner, or about $1,200. As far as I could tell, they left him with most of his elements, except for the radioactive ones, of course. And even though probably no one would disagree that splitting an atom in your kitchen is somewhat ill-advised, it's important to remember that for every Richard Handel, there's a Steve Jobs or a Charles Goodyear. They also started at home. Charles Goodyear developed the process of hardening rubber by mixing sulfur with virgin rubber on his wife's stove in their kitchen. As far as what's happening with Richard now, at one point he said, quote, "Actually, I'm thinking of trying again to become a pharmacist. I'm going to read up on some courses from the high school and begin to study in the university," end quote. I'm not sure if that revisited dream ever came true, but these days, it seems like, at least according to his Instagram, Richard is really into camping. Someone did ask him on his page if he was the guy who tried to divide atoms, and Richard responded, quote, "Well, but it didn't go so well," end quote. He seems to have gotten himself into better physical shape and has a cute tabby cat. He still has his blog, although he mostly posts pictures of said cat. Oh, and he managed to finish his real-life periodic table of the elements, which according to him, quote, took 30 years to get all the basics together, except the radioactive ones, of course, end quote. Thanks for hanging out with me. I think Richard gets a bad rap. He's just a big old science nerd that boy-bossed a little too close to the sun. In another life, he might have been Hannes himself, or Goodyear. Thank you to all of you who have listened to my continual pleas for you to rate and review Capers and Cocktails wherever you listen or watch if you haven't. I'd really appreciate it if you took 5 minutes to do it. I promise it doesn't take a long time, probably less than 5 minutes, and it helps to push the content out to more people. Thank you. Next week is a skipped upload, but I'll see you in 2 weeks. And remember, there are always alternatives to trying to split atoms in your kitchen.